Hi, Jay.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I am really well. How are you?
I'm not complaining at all. I'm fine. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Jay Michaelson. You are a rabbi, a meditation teacher, a scholar affiliated with, I think, the Chicago Theological Seminary. You've been an
hmm
LGBT activist. You write a column twice weekly for the Daily Beast. You've written a number of books, including Evolving Dharma, which we mainly won't be talking about today, but we will be talking about The Gate of Tears, Sadness and the Spiritual Path, because it's hot off the presses. And so we're going to talk about sadness, which shouldn't
Which
discourage
is really
people from
about
listening.
happiness.
Right. We should point out at the outset that people are going to feel super exhilarated at the end. So they should stick with us here. We're not going to make
I
them
think they I
sad.
think they will feel exhilarated. I'm committed to that.
Okay, good. You mean that non ironically. Good, good.
I mean it non-ironically. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Okay. So, for starters, this book is kind of from a Buddhist perspective, right?
Yeah. I think it's a third Buddhist, a third Jewish, and a third secular humanist Western pop culture.
Okay. Is it possible to identify which parts are which? Like if I said, what's the Jewish part? What, would you have an answer?
Usually, the parts that use the G word are the Jewish ones.
Ah, the
The
G
G
word.
word being God. But I think actually a little more seriously, the parts, I think we're all hybridizers, right, in the 21st century, and I just try to make it as overt as possible. But I'm really interested not just in being with difficult emotions and working with them in a sort of Dharma way, but also learning from them and seeing them as gateways to the sacred or the holy, and that's comes from my Jewish background.
I would. Is there no tension between that and the secular humanist part of the book?
I don't think so. I think most of my rabbi friends are also deeply informed by Leonard Cohen, Bob Dylan, Burning Man, and all the other influences that are in there. So for me, I think again, I'm a triple hybridizer.
Okay, okay. Well, you're ahead of me. Um, so let's talk about sadness. I mean, first of all, how did you decide to write a book about sadness?
So this book had an unusual story in that I actually started it 12 years ago when I was just sort of starting out in the Theravadan Buddhist meditation path that now I teach in a Theravadan lineage, and I felt like I had sort of discovered something which, in fact, I had not discovered, but the Buddha had discovered 25 years ago, that it was possible to have a different relationship to difficult emotions than the usual one. And I was filled with the enthusiasm that you sometimes find among beginning meditators, and so I wrote this version of this book, and mostly on the advice of a teacher of mine who said she was not interested in what I had to say on the subject. I put it on a shelf for a while. And then about 2 years ago, my mother became quite ill. She actually passed away this past January. And going through that process, I sort of looked again at these at the teachings that had been the core of that book, and ended up rewriting it, and then rewriting it again during this 2 year process of her illness, and really did feel as though this was the book I wanted to put out. It's a little more personal than some of my other books, and it's a little bit more. It's kind of my first Dharma book in a while. That's meant to be first person as well as third person. I think in a teaching modality. Um, but it's still true. I mean, this was the sort of Dharma teaching I most wanted to teach in the world, even though it's very basic. I found it very difficult to convey, and yet utterly life changing.
Okay. You mean your life changed in the course of writing it, or you think it can
I think
change readers' lives,
in
or
the
both?
both. I mean, I speak from my own experience. I definitely there's a chapter in the book called "Don't Believe Your Teachers," and I think that's good advice. Of course, coming from a teacher, it's
Right.
hard to
Don't,
follow that
except
advice.
for this one teacher. Don't believe your
Yes,
teachers.
exactly. Right.
Yeah.
It's sort of the all Cretans are liars, the great paradox. Don't listen to any advice. So yeah, no, I just speak from my own experience, and I found, I think early on in my own contemplative path, I was promised sugar candy mountain. It was like everything was going to be great, and I would be happy forever. And that's what some of the teachers say. The Buddha was called the happy one, and in the Jewish tradition, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov said, quoted, really said, it's a great commandment to be happy always. But if you really dig under that a little bit, that can't possibly be true in the conventional sense. We're not supposed to be happy at funerals. We're not supposed to be happy in cancer wards. We're not supposed to be happy at injustice. So they must have something different in mind when they're talking about happiness. That's why I said, unironically, this is really a book about joy, because I have found there is a kind of contemplative joy, and I know you've written on this as well, that coexists with all kinds of different emotional states. So it's possible to be quite sad and quite happy at the same time, because we're talking about the happiness that doesn't depend on conditions, the happiness just of being itself. And that's a very quiet, subtle, and I think beautiful kind of contemplative joy that sometimes gets underplayed in the context of dour Buddhism and life is suffering.
Okay. So you think it's possible to actually have both feelings at once, joy and happiness?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, sadness and happiness.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think with happiness being defined in the way that the contemplatives are talking about it, that it's a sort of more profound sense of contentment with being, if you like, or this is why I think it's such a subtle thing, because it's not something that we really have language for. This kind of contemplative joy that coexists again even with anger, with grief, with loss, sometimes with activity to remedy injustice. That there's also this sense of self-sufficiency that for me did not come easy. It came through a lot of years of work on the cushion.
Okay, so to try to give non-meditators some idea of what you're talking about, why don't we step back and ask you, what do you think the most common mistake is that people make in trying to deal with sadness?
Trying to get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most common, and that's not just a contemporary mistake or a human mistake. It's an animal mistake, right? Every creature, when it's presented with an unpleasant stimulus, will recoil, will try to move away from it. That's natural. We're just wired that way. And yet, there was a famous Hasidic rabbi in the 1960s named Mick Jagger who said, "You can't always get what you want," and that's the problem. You can't always get what you do want, and you can't always avoid what you don't want. And so that instinctive, very natural, wonderful instinct that we all have that preserves our lives and enables us to exist in the world also creates a certain kind of extra suffering that doesn't always have to be there. So, if your hand is about to touch a hot stove, it would be good to pull back right away. If your heart is about to touch a difficult emotion, it might be really helpful to not pull back right away, but to enable it to simply unfold for what it is, not wallow in sadness. The book is definitely not, and I'm definitely not, about endlessly tilling over the same psychic material over and over and over again, but rather experiencing what is taking place. The cliche, another chapter in the book is called The Cliche of the Present Moment, and it is a cliche, but what is actually happening in a present moment, whatever that moment is. And if it's sadness, it's sadness. It sounds like this, or it sounds like that, or it feels like this. And that for me, again, it seems very simple, but I think because it runs directly counter to 5 billion years of evolution, it's a little bit counterintuitive.
So what are some common ways that people try to evade sadness these days? When you just observe people doing what you're not recommending, what specific things are they doing?
I would say 90% of capitalist activity, but also, even spiritual and religious folks, right? So if I have some belief, for example, that I can create my own reality, or that I can live in a world that conforms exactly to my wishes, or if I have a feeling come up that's meditators aren't supposed to feel that way. Yogis aren't supposed to feel that way. Christians, Jews, we're not supposed to feel that way. A feeling that might be sadness or grief, but might also be anger, or might just be, cheering for the Mets, in their playoff series. Oh no, spiritual people aren't supposed to do that, because that obviously is going to bring some dukkha, right? Some suffering.
Well, we'll find out tonight,
we'll
given when we're taping this.
That's exactly right. So that I think it's something that it's not just the bad guys over there, with their sports cars and and bad taste in movies. I think it's also all of us who take the religious or spiritual path seriously.
Okay, so can you try to give non-meditators a sense of how they might do what you're recommending, rather than run away from sadness, rather than go down to the kitchen and find something to eat, or find something to buy, or whatever? actually, how do you actually, I don't know if confront is quite the right word, but is there an actual instruction you can give people of the kind you might give them if you were their meditation teacher, but that would make sense to them even if they don't have any meditation practice under their belt?
Yeah, so I'll actually cite a meditation teacher, one that I think both of us have sat with, Joseph Goldstein, who said at one point that, a lot of life's pain and suffering is very similar to knee pain in meditation. He actually suffers from very acute knee pain when he's sitting, so it wasn't a flip comment. What he means by that is, so you're sitting in meditation and some unpleasant distraction comes up. It could be knee pain or back pain, or it could be a thought. It could be remembering something that my coworker said or something like that. And, so the normal response, again, thanks to 5 billion years of evolution, is to, kind of push it away. Paradoxically, the pushing away may actually look like going into it more. The idea being, well, if I really think this through with my boss, I'll somehow feel better. I can actually, let me play this tape one more time and just wallow in it again. So the instruction I would give the non-meditator does come from meditation, which is, what would it be like to just be with, or in the meditation context, sit with that unpleasant sensation? So here comes knee pain. I'm not going to move my leg, which is what we would normally do. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to ignore it or try to push it out of my head. I'm not going to just, start a story about, oh my God, how can I do this? I can't believe how I can't sit still anymore. That kind of stuff. Just, what does it feel like? What's it like?
So actually examine its contours. Which with knee pain is maybe not going to be all that revelatory, since you already knew it was in your knee. But sadness, funnily enough, people as familiar as they are with it, they don't give much thought to like where it is in their head or the rest of their body. And that in itself is an exploration that starts changing your relationship to it, right? To start asking yourself, where exactly am I feeling this, for starters?
You're right. And physically, where am I feeling it? There'll always be, what is taking place in the present moment around sadness is generally some kind of physical sensation. It might be a heaviness in the chest or something, or wherever it is. So that you could look at that. And that's what's actually happening right now. And then there's a story. There's some reason. Sometimes I've had a sensation. I've just, had a bit of sadness come on and don't really know why. And so then my mind starts looking for it. Oh, well, let's go through the usual catalog of Jay's failures and disappointments and figure out which one of them is probably responsible. That has not been very fruitful over the years. And I do want to say that is fruitful in some contexts, right? Psychoanalysis, for example, or therapy, right? We do want to go into the story because the idea is that we might actually learn something. But generally speaking, I'd say 95% of the time, when it's just me, it's much more, I've just found it much more helpful to just, all right, this is what's happening. It's this isn't what I wanted, but it's what I've got, in the words of one of my teachers, Sylvia Boorstein. This is what it is. It's a little bit of another California cliche, it is what it is. But there is a wisdom there. This is what's actually taking place. It comes and it goes. All the sort of Buddhist-y Dharma insights come along very quickly. It comes and goes. It's not so pleasant. I didn't make it happen. It just came along. But also, there is this other level that sadness opens us up to all kinds of beauty, to different kinds of human connection, to kinds of compassion, and I would say even the sacred, the sense of the numinous, which can arise when the resistance to whatever is taking place is just released.
So, describe that a little. I mean, well, first of all, when you deal with sadness in this way, sometimes you actually sit down and assume the meditative posture for the purpose of dealing with sadness, and then maybe sometimes you don't get that formal about it, but you kind of just accept it and explore it.
Yeah, I rarely sit in a particular posture at some moment. It's much more a little bit of a recognition. Oh, that's what it is. Sometimes, like you were saying before, we don't really know what's going on inside our hearts and heads. I could be running around trying to think of something to do or feel restlessness, and almost always for me, and everybody's experience is different, that's usually covering something else. So I'll just feel like, what's really going on here, right? What am I really feeling here? What's happening? So it just might be a pause and just looking, oh yeah, And sometimes the answer is really simple. I'm hungry. It doesn't have to be something profound. And sometimes it is profound. I think all of us who go through a grieving process know that it's not a linear process. And so certainly in the last 9-10 months since my mother's passing, grief just arises. Mm-hmm. And one of my teachers pointed out that, sometimes the mind starts to confront stuff when it thinks it's ready to do so. So you may think you're done, and then something new comes up. And that's actually just the mind, or the mind-body system, if you like. I'll just say the mind. Feeling like it's okay to now have this next piece come up. But, it just happens. And it happens at inconvenient moments. I'll be at a Broadway show and think of my mom, or I'll be, something like that. And that can really be a teacher. And that can really be, when my father passed away, it was in 1997. So I was much younger. And I really would kind of beat myself up over feeling these eruptions of grief. What's wrong with me? Come on, it's been a year. It's been this, it's been that. I shouldn't feel this way. Why is this happening? What can I do to deal with this better so that it doesn't happen? It kind of hurts to even say that. I mean, that was so unfortunate. The grief is the grief. It's doing its thing. But this commentary that it should be doing it differently, that's where for me, that's where the suffering comes in.
Okay. And so when you say that dealing with sadness in a particular way can lead you to kind of encounter the numinous, by which I guess you kind of mean the divine, to put it in more common terms, is that right?
Yeah, I'm hedging my bets.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, well, if you want to, you can get into the distinction between the numinous and the divine. I mean, divine's a much more common term, and numinous an almost not quite academic term, but more obscure term. I mean, I guess is it Kantian for one thing? I mean,
I'm using it. Yeah, I guess it was originally in Kant, yeah. But Rudolf Otto uses it. A lot of sort of scholars of mysticism.
In the book, The Idea. Of the
for
Whole.
Me, the reason I like that term is a little bit because it's non-committal in a certain way. It seems absolutely the case that the sense of the holy or the sense of the sacred is something that arises if we let it, and if the conditions are right, obviously. For some people that may only happen at extraordinary events, the birth of a child or something like that. But I think it's worthwhile to train the mind or the heart to sense that, have that similar sense to that, at each sunrise. When Warren Zevon had his terminal, I think it was cancer, his terminal diagnosis, and David Letterman asked him, what have you learned anything from having a terminal diagnosis? And he had like 3 or 4 months to live, and he said, enjoy every sandwich. That seems like pretty good advice, and so that sense of gratitude, appreciation, love, awe, the sense of mystery. I'm trying to capture that net of feelings without committing and saying, well, yeah, that's God or that's the divine. Because I think it's also possible to interpret and understand the numinous in a non-theistic way. Mm-hmm. And certainly that happens in certain Buddhist traditions.
So that's the secular humanist third of your book. And the Jewish third would say divine.
I guess that's right. But I think, actually, I think the secular humanist piece is more about learning from sadness in everyday life, and writing beautiful pop songs and listening to Miles Davis and, all those kinds of things that our Western culture is good at. And for me, even the numinous piece, I file in my Jewish box a little bit.
I see. And is it possible to describe kind of how, at a micro level, the exploration of sadness leads to the numinous? I mean, is there some point in the process of is it the point at which you've kind of really come to terms with the sadness, and in that sense been liberated from its grip, even though it hasn't necessarily gone away as a feeling, right? But you're no longer enslaved by it the way you were. Is it like a moment of liberation that's associated with the numinous, or what?
I would say it is, but in the sense of the Tibetan Buddhists say of small moments many times. It's not necessarily a big wow moment and then I'm set for 6 months. I mean, it might be something that happens 30 times a day, where there's just a releasing of the sense of resistance to what is. A previous book I wrote was called Everything is God, The Radical Path of Non-Dual Judaism. So the basic theology underneath it is that non-dual theology, that everything is God, and not that God is only everything, but since the what's left after everything is nothing, that makes God everything plus nothing, which isn't a big difference. Anyway, that was mostly for yours and my amusement.
Well, it's worth getting into a little what we mean by non-dual, I think, or what you mean by non-dual. I mean, it's certainly associated with a certain part of Hindu tradition, Advaita Vedanta. But I guess it's also, some Buddhists might talk that way and some might not. But say a little more about what you meant in that book, Everything is God, by non-dual Judaism.
So there I was really exploring the non-dual Jewish traditions, which do exist. Certainly in the 18th and 19th century Hasidic worlds, they were very insistent that the whole world is filled with God and is nothing but God, and that God fills and surrounds the universe. And they did take it to its logical conclusions. There are a couple of these writers who I talk about in that book who really do have a very Hindu-like conclusion that we're living in a kind of delusion, and that it's possible to go back and forth. I'd say one difference between the Jewish and the Hindu conceptions is the Jewish ones like having both the divine point of view in which everything is God and the human point of view in which it's you and me and a podcast and so on. That's a little bit of a distinction. There's not really saying one's good and one's enlightenment and the other is delusion. But the basic thought is quite similar. And I think that's really profound thinking and relating to the everyday world. And that's what kind of underlies the theology in the third part of the Gate of Tears.
So the idea is that the distinction between kind of you and the rest of the world, which we've already established is divine in this view, is kind of illusory, that you are part of the divine and vice versa.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what's tricky in the Kabbalah and in Hasidism is that everything's couched in things like wordplay. But one very simple example of that is they want to move from the word ani, which means I, which has 3 Hebrew letters, and if you just move one of the letters, you get to ayin, which means nothingness or everythingness, in the same way that emptiness. So it's just the I is actually emptiness. Again, that's a little more
Buddhist. That's a little more Buddhist than Hindu.
That's true. Yeah, it's a full emptiness. It's an everything and nothing. So the point being that what's the spiritual work is shifting my own perspective. So they take a lot of the Jewish teachers use that statement that Jacob makes after seeing the ladder, that God was in this place and I didn't know. Right? There's that interesting stutter in the Hebrew as well. So it's not to say that God's somewhere else. God's not just on top of the ladder. God's in this place right now. But there's a reason that I don't know. The reason is that I don't perceive it. That I don't perceive it is, again, those 5 billion years of evolution, that we want what's pleasant, we don't want what's unpleasant. And so for me, when there's the releasing of the running away, the releasing of no, like, no, I don't want this feeling. No, I'm not going to, no, this shouldn't be. When that gets released, there is a kind of a bliss of yes. And I experience that not merely as a kind of liberation in a Theravadan Buddhist sense, but in a sense of the holy. And that's true in all traditions, including the Buddhist one, have that notion. But for me, because of my kind of background in Jewish mysticism, it resonates the most with those teachings. Not that it's a Jewish idea, or it's an idea that I think that's found in all of these different traditions.
And it is a tricky matter, actually ceasing to run from the emotion, sadness in this case. I mean, it's very easy to be meditating and say, I'm not running away from this, I'm focused on it. And yet, you feel the part of you that wants to be free of it. That's the part. You feel the aversion. You are steadfastly looking at it, but you feel the aversion, and that's not trivially easy to let go of.
No, it sucks. I mean, it's horrible. I tell a story in the book about a time where I was on a long retreat, a 6-week retreat, and kind of midway through the retreat, a teacher said something, triggered me, and I had a week of just sitting with all of this self-hatred from being closeted when I was younger, and all of this stuff that came up. I didn't ask for it at all. There's a great Buddhist book called "Who Ordered This Truckload of Dung," which I think is a great way of describing what takes place. You're just sitting there.
Always a good.
You're just sitting. Yeah, exactly. You're just sitting there on the cushion, right? I mean, I didn't ask for this. I'm not, and and yet there it is. There it shows up.
Mhm.
I was having a conversation earlier actually with there's a great podcast called Buddhist Geeks,
Right, I
and
know
it's
it. Yes.
young Buddhists and stuff. We were talking about it, and on everybody's first or second or third retreat, you see the person kind of next to you or two seats over who's having some huge emotional thing, and when that happened for me, my first reaction was judgment. I'm not gonna be one of those people. I'm not
Yeah.
doing
I
that.
don't cry at
That
retreats.
it took me like, yeah, I'm not here to see my inner child.
Yeah.
That's for, and sure enough, 2 or 3 days later, it took me a while to get over that resistance. 2 or 3 days later, though, I was that person, and it's that it just works by breaking you. I mean, if it doesn't, it seems like a very peaceful process, but you're sitting there on a cushion, but all kinds of things are happening. But absolutely, it's the pushing away of the difficult that is 90% of the difficult. It's not to say that knee pain isn't real and that grief and emotion aren't real. These are things, but it's that trying to get back to my happy place, which is right there in the center of religion and spirituality and meditation, as well as, ordinary consumerist culture. That's where the suffering comes in.
Yeah. So generically speaking, the way you deal with sadness would be the way you would deal with anxiety or any number of other troublesome emotions. Observe it, but don't run from it. In theory, right?
In theory, yeah. There was one time, where I'd had actually right after my mom got her diagnosis, I had a really difficult situation at a job that I had for a while, and it was just this intense 1-2 punch, and it was an important learning moment for me because actually my practice really failed. I just couldn't do it. There was so much anxiety. It was in the body. So I could actually work with the mental anxiety, seeing the story start again, putting it down, seeing the story cut. And then I did all kinds of other things. I did concentration stuff, just staying on the breath, not actually investigating the anxiety, but just, taking a break from it.
Mm-hmm.
But there was just too much. It was in the body, and I physically couldn't sit, I felt. And so, it's not like, I'm glad that you said in theory, because in practice, sometimes you just can't do that.
I actually, in a way, I find anxiety more problematic than sadness. I mean, that business of having trouble letting go of the aversion to it, you're watching it, but you just don't like it, and it's a hard fact to get around. For some reason, it seems to me that sadness is easier to just kind of relax into. It's somehow easier for me to let go. Maybe I haven't been sad enough lately or something, but and it would be more problematic if I had. But does that? I mean, all these feelings are different in terms of the challenge of coming to terms with them, right?
Yeah, that resonates with my experience. And if I could get Orthodox Buddhist for just a moment, anxiety usually has a lot of restlessness with it, which is classically one of the 5 hindrances. And those are the five qualities of mind that make it impossible to meditate, basically.
Right.
And so there are all kinds of skillful techniques to work with them when they come along. So the idea when restlessness is present is not just noting that restlessness is present. That's part of it. But then it's, there are techniques to make it go away. So I think you're right. There is a difference between different negative emotions. Ill will, for example, is seen in in my Buddhist tradition as kind of a problem. You don't want a lot of ill will floating around, and that's anger, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sadness is not really one of those. It's not seen as an obstacle. So I think you're right to point out that there are different skills for different mind states. I think I'd also like to just quickly throw in at that moment, I think sometimes there's a sense that we have of confusing sadness and depression. And I try to be careful in the book to really draw that distinction. And I think it's an important one. Sadness to me is part of a life well lived. It's just part of what it is to be human. I'm not sure that's true about depression, right? I'm not a doctor, and so I don't give medical advice, but certainly what we understand about depression in the brain, but also what we understand about depression just phenomenologically, what it's like to be depressed. It's not, having an up and down, the sadness being the down. It's sort of depressing, lowering, the total affect level. So I wanted to just throw that in as a distinction because I think it's important not to confuse those.
Mm-hmm. Now, the book is structured in an interesting way. I mean, in terms of I guess you might say, the size of the chapters. Very short chunks. A lot of them are kind of like homilies. Some of them are too short for that. They're almost like aphorisms or short poems or something. Is that meant to be particularly well suited to the subject matter? I mean, did you imagine, like, what do sad people need in a book? You know, maybe something bite sized. Maybe. How did you think about that?
So I think there were two reasons that I chose to do it that way, and I'd never written a book like that before. Usually I write in much more kind of conventional form. Part of it was an aesthetic ambition. I think, and I wonder if you share this view. So much of kind of spiritual writing is bad writing. It's just, and I really had an ambition. I don't know if I achieved it or not, but I had an ambition to write in such a way that it felt like good writing to me. I have a writing degree. I collect graduate degrees, so I have one of those, and I've written a book of poems. And I wanted this to have, I think, the best spiritual writing, not coincidentally, happens to be really good writing. And I think the rhetoric of it carries one or evokes the sensibility that the writer is trying to convey. So it's in the how, not just the what of how a book is written. So I felt that, and that does lead to that second piece, the second ambition about writing it that way. I almost felt as though, and I still feel as though, this is 85 ways of looking at kind of the same phenomenon, and I didn't have a detailed argument that I wanted to make. The Buddha made my argument, and if he didn't, then the Hasidic rabbis did. What I wanted to do was evoke some of how I experience this liberation and happiness that comes from accepting all of these different emotions. And that felt like, I cut a lot of words from the original manuscript. I don't like when spiritual teachers speak in first person plural. We're all feeling this and we're all feeling that, and get sort of pedantic about it. And I have right. So I mentioned already that chapter. Don't listen to teachers. Don't believe your teachers. So I really wanted to I hate this to use a cliche, but speak from the heart a little bit in a way that evoked the spirituality of sadness.
Okay. And one of the chapters, I believe, is called "What is Spirituality?" One thing I commonly do is ask people what spirituality is, partly by way of trying to clarify the commonly made distinction between spiritual and religious. But in any event, what's your working definition of spiritual?
So it's interesting. That chapter was really meant to elucidate the difference between spirituality and spirituality, because I think it sometimes means really diametrically opposed things. And I'm fully in favor of the spirituality of having positive mind states. Great, go for it. Joy, ecstasy, ecstatic prayer. These experiences are human birthright. They've been developed over thousands of years by very, very wise people, and I love it. I teach a kind of meditation, the jhana meditation in the Theravadan tradition, which is about having certain kinds of profound experiences. So I'm all about that. However, I think what I tried to say in that chapter, for me, that a deeper, for me, or a more nourishing kind of spirituality is not chasing a particular experience, but actually embracing all of the experiences that arise. So it's less about going, on Friday night, if I'll go to a synagogue, I go in thinking about work, but I come out thinking about love. That's great. That's fine. But I'm actually more interested, less in that slight inflection of the mind that is at peace with whatever's arising, including, right now I've been moving apartments. That's not fun. So, there's a lot of moving. So if I'm looking for my happy place and feeling, finding my Zen in that ridiculous cliche in the middle of trying to move apartments, it's gonna be hard to find. I mean, I can take some deep breaths, I could do it, but rather than zen out in the the euphemism, I'd much rather, okay, here's what's happening. There's stuff going on. I feel a sense of dislocation. There's a little concern about the movers, breaking stuff, but actually things are going pretty smoothly, and that's good. And my partner and I have been doing well together. We're not, getting through the move together feels like an accomplishment. That feels just more authentic to me, and it feels more truthful. And so whatever spirituality is, I feel like it has to do something with the truth.
So you mean it's more truthful than trying to turn it into a kind of a blissful experience?
Yeah, or pretending that the blissful experience is what's happening. Yeah, I mean, I don't, I guess you could subtitle my book "The Power of Negative Thinking," uh, and positive thinking is great, right? And that's great, but I do also think that there is a capacity for empathy and for human connection that comes up when we're able to be a little bit more authentic. Yeah, I just had this story. This thing happened last night, so I told it to Buddhist geeks. I'll repeat it. I was at a bar with a friend, just having a drink. Somebody I just met, so sort of a new friend, and he said, as we were talking, I guess I just have a lot of trouble making friends. And I said in response, I was probably a little too California in this response, but I said, well, maybe that's how you do it. That just being that open. I just thought that was a really sweet thing of him to say, that he trusted me enough in that moment. It was a casual moment. It wasn't like a big deal. To be open about that he's struggling making friends. He's been in New York for a year.
And he didn't reply, but I've been doing this my whole life and I still don't have any friends.
No, he basically asked, what the hell are you talking about?
Okay.
Yeah, but
it's a good point. It's a good point. Yeah. It's appealing when people are candid.
I react negatively to folks who are trying to impress me with how happy, successful they are. A little demon inside of me wants to find out what they're hiding, in their personal closet. I just resonate much more with folks who are open about a wide range of human experience, from the joy and the success to the not joy and the not success. And when I'm at a social gathering and someone's suddenly authentic about their own experience, I find that a real attractor.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of something you say in the book. You write, "The gate of tears is the less chosen way among my high-functioning colleagues in the worlds of journalism and advocacy. It seems like a kind of weakness." Now, first of all, you seem pretty high-functioning to me, at least to gauge by sheer quantity of output. So I'm not sure you're qualified to distinguish yourself from these high-functioning, or maybe you're not trying to. I mean, aren't you pretty high-functioning?
Yeah, no, I think I run in different worlds, and it's definitely true that as I've worked as a political activist at times, or now as a quasi-journalist opinion writer, there's something a little embarrassing about, we don't want to bring too much of our humanity to the office, which is sometimes a good thing. I don't necessarily want to hear everybody's stuff of everybody I happen to be working with. But it's more than that, especially I've spent a little time through the Evolving Dharma book and that world, in the sort of innovation economy and all the kind of tech world and that kind of stuff. And there is this denial of depth that I find. I don't want to extrapolate from my own experience to talk societally, but just in some of these high functioning spaces, there's just not a lot of sincerity. And I think that's a loss. I just did a piece for the Daily Beast that said I'm embarrassed about my spirituality, because in that context, yeah, you want to be cynical, you want to be a little bit ironic, and you want to constantly be kind of tearing stuff down and demystifying. And so to actually fess up and say, not only am I a rabbi and a meditation teacher, but now I've written a book about sadness, it didn't feel like a very good career move. In that career, but I have these different careers, and I love it. I love the way that's worked out for me. But I did feel like a little loss of credibility when I told people the title of the book.
Really? And did you get bad reactions to it? Negative reactions?
Not that were vocalized. I got a few eyebrow raises. I think it's still interesting. I was just invited to be on Fox News today based on a piece I wrote about the Middle East, and I couldn't do it because I'd had a couple of conversations scheduled already about the Gate of Tears. I thought, should I really tell them that? Would they still have me on as a pundit talking about the Middle East if they were aware that I had these conversations about sadness and spirituality? I don't see not only do I not see the tension between them, actually, given the current moment in the Middle East, sadness is my predominant emotion around it. It's just such a tragic moment, and it's I don't know if tempting is the right word, but that's the word in mind. It's so tempting to go to either the rage at one side or the other, or both sides, or to a sense of despair, hopelessness, blocking it out. And for me, there's some really interesting thinking about this on the in the context of for the environmental crisis and climate change, about how the vastness of the despair can sometimes cause us to shut down. So for me, one of the juncture points between this kind of spirituality and justice work, social justice work, is that it does actually, it's enabling me to be truthful about what I'm actually feeling. So in this case, in the Middle East, I lived in Israel for 3 years, and I worked in various sort of peace camp movements within Israel. There's just so much sadness. I mean, it's just such a horrible moment that's happening right now. And I have my reasons for why that's who's responsible, and other people have different reasons. But I also want to stay with the sadness that's on both sides right now. And that, I think, makes me more able to be multi-perspectival, which is, I think, the key in the Middle East in
Is
particular.
that almost part of the definition of spirituality, or maybe should it be the ability to put yourself in the shoes of people whose circumstances are radically different from your own, and even who might superficially at least have an antagonistic relationship toward you or toward your culture or something? I mean, is that an explicit part of the spiritual program for you? Is it part of the definition of spirituality, or what?
I think for me it is. I think it's one of the necessary consequences for the word to mean anything. I think the Buddhist formulation of wisdom and compassion kind of hits it. The Jewish formulation would be that there are two elements: the part that's between the human and God, which is kind of that part, and then the between human beings and one another, which is you and I've talked at length about spirituality and social justice, or mysticism and social justice. So for me, those are the two axes of the spiritual path, and I think one without the other is, I don't want to judge anybody else's spiritual path, but for me, it would feel incomplete.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, listen, is there anything else you want to say about the book, which I'm trying to find so I can hold it up again? Oh, it's down here. Anything else you want to say about it?
Well, I really feel like the folks who have gotten to minute 45 of our conversation, I want to thank them, because this for me really has been a labor of love, this book. Having done a bunch of books, there's some books that our agents like and some books that our agents wish we wouldn't write. And writing happiness does sell better than sadness, and I knew that going in, but I really feel really grateful, I think, for having this be the book that's out for me right now. It allows me a certain capacity to fail as a spiritual teacher, which means, I'm just not able to practice what I preach, because that's part of the teaching. And I really, in these last few weeks, as things have gotten so much worse in Israel and in Palestine, it's actually, I'm so grateful that I didn't write a book about how awesome everything is. And it just feels, here in the United States with Black Lives Matter and with climate change and with so many other issues, it actually, I feel a sense of real gratitude to you and to the folks who are watching and anyone who's joining me in this journey, because it has been a labor of love.
I'm kind of surprised that agents would necessarily be down kind of instinctively on a book about sadness. I mean, a lot of people are sad. It's something they have to deal with. They're looking for ways to deal with it. It doesn't seem to me like commercial suicide. It's like
well, I've called the book a self-helpless book instead of self-help. I mean, I think people are looking for books to cure their sadness, so those are the books that are all about happiness, how to be happy.
This is a cure of sort. It cures you of the part of sadness that is problematic, by and large, wouldn't you say? I mean,
I tell you what, you pitch that to your agent and tell me what they say. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I really do believe that. And I wasn't kidding at the beginning when I said, ultimately this book is about happiness. It's about a counterintuitive kind of happiness. And I think it's hard to find that space where we're accepting and even loving the sadness, but it's not about wallowing in the sadness. We're not like, it's great to be sad all the time. No, it's great to be happy a lot of the time too. So it is hard. It's a subtle message, and but it's one that, again, I feel really grateful to have been able to write a book on what I think is the most important teaching for me right now. It just feels really, really connected, and hopefully I'm practicing what I preach in that authenticity.
Okay, well, congratulations on it. The Gate of Tears, Sadness, and the Spiritual Path by Jay Michaelson. Other books include Evolving Dharma, and maybe sometime you can come back and talk about this one, even though it's a less commercially opportune moment to talk about a book when it's not brand new, but that would be a great conversation. And,
I'd love to do that.
And good luck with the book, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.